the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis emerged from a volatile intersection of unresolved civil war, alliance commitments, and nuclear-era deterrence, and by 1958, it had evolved into a sustained military confrontation that fell short of declared war while repeatedly threatening escalation beyond regional control. Because the Chinese Civil War had never formally ended, and the offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu remained under the control of the Republic of China despite their proximity to the mainland, creating a persistent flashpoint that symbolized competing claims of legitimacy between Beijing and Taipei. And in the years following the Korean War, this unresolved situation acquired new strategic weight as the People's Republic of China consolidated power, rebuilt its armed forces, and sought to challenge what it viewed as an intolerable remnant of foreign-backed resistance along its coast, while the United States, bound by its security relationship with Taiwan and determined to maintain credibility in Asia, treated the defense of the offshore islands as a test case for containment under conditions of nuclear parity still in formation, and by the mid-1950s, both sides had already probed these boundaries through earlier confrontations. Yet it was the artillery bombardment initiated in August 1958 that transformed the Taiwan Strait into a sustained Cold War battlefield, not through maneuver warfare or invasion, but through a deliberate campaign of firepower, calibrated to exert pressure without triggering immediate escalation. As the People's Liberation Army opened an intense shelling of Quemoy that delivered tens of thousands of rounds in a matter of weeks, targeting military installations, supply points, and infrastructure in a pattern designed to signal resolve while retaining the option to pause or modulate intensity. And this method of pressure warfare reflected a strategic calculation in Beijing that direct amphibious assault carried unacceptable risks given American naval superiority, whereas sustained bombardment could test U.S. commitments, strain Taiwanese defenses, and demonstrate the costs of continued resistance without crossing thresholds that might justify nuclear retaliation. And the operational conduct of the bombardment revealed careful coordination between political signaling and military execution, as periods of heavy shelling alternated with lulls that allowed resupply and evacuation, creating a rhythm that prolonged the crisis and forced Washington into repeated reassessment of its response options. And within the United States, the crisis triggered urgent debates over credibility, deterrence, and escalation control, because the Eisenhower administration faced the challenge of defending positions of ambiguous strategic value without becoming trapped in an open-ended commitment that could escalate into general war with a nuclear-armed adversary. And this dilemma was sharpened by the fact that the offshore islands were militarily exposed and logistically dependent on sea lines that could only be kept open through active U.S. involvement, drawing American forces directly into the confrontation. And as U.S. naval units escorted Taiwanese resupply convoys through the strait, the crisis took on an operational dimension that extended beyond artillery exchanges, incorporating air defense deployments, intelligence collection, and contingency planning for potential escalation scenarios that ranged from expanded conventional conflict to the use of nuclear weapons against mainland targets, scenarios that were discussed with a seriousness that reflected the incomplete development of nuclear restraint norms in the late 1950s. And on the Chinese side, the crisis served multiple strategic purposes beyond the immediate military objective of pressuring Quemoy, including reinforcing domestic legitimacy through confrontation with external adversaries, signaling resolve to both allies and rivals within the socialist bloc, and testing the limits of U.S. willingness to defend peripheral positions, all while avoiding actions that would unify opposing coalitions or justify overwhelming retaliation And this balancing act was evident in the decision to announce, after weeks of bombardment, a pattern of shelling on alternate days, a move that combined military pressure with political messaging by framing the conflict as a limited and controlled struggle rather than a prelude to invasion, allowing Beijing to claim initiative while presenting itself as exercising restraint. And this framing complicated U.S. decision-making by blurring the distinction between active hostilities and managed confrontation, forcing American planners to consider whether continued defense of the islands risked normalizing a level of conflict that could erode deterrence over time. And throughout this period, intelligence assessments played a critical role in shaping responses, as both sides sought to interpret the other's intentions through fragmentary signals, troop movements, and diplomatic communications, often under conditions of uncertainty that magnified the consequences of misinterpretation. And as the crisis extended into 1959 and beyond, it became clear that the artillery war was not a temporary outburst, but a sustained instrument of pressure that institutionalized the Taiwan Strait as a permanent Cold War front line, one in which violence was continuous yet bounded, and where the absence of formal war masked the constant presence of escalation risk, a condition that would persist through 1961 and shape subsequent approaches to crisis management in Asia, demonstrating how Cold War conflicts could be prolonged indefinitely through calibrated force, alliance signaling, and mutual restraint, even as they imposed enduring costs and strategic tension on all parties involved. As the artillery campaign settled into a prolonged pattern after the initial shock of August 1958, the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis entered a phase defined less by immediate battlefield outcomes than by sustained strategic signaling, because the shelling of Quemoy continued to impose constant pressure on Taiwanese defenses while compelling the United States to maintain an elevated military posture that carried political and operational costs. And this endurance dimension was central to Beijing's approach, as the People's Liberation Army calibrated its fire to remain destructive enough to deny any sense of normalcy on the islands, while avoiding the decisive blows that might provoke an uncontrollable response. A balance reflected in the alternation between intense bombardments and deliberately announced pauses that transformed artillery fire into a form of political communication as much as a military tool. And within Taiwan, the effects were cumulative and severe, as infrastructure damage, civilian displacement, and the psychological strain of unpredictable shelling tested the resilience of both the garrison and the broader population, forcing Taipei to rely increasingly on American logistical and advisory support to sustain the defense, a reliance that reinforced Taiwan's strategic dependence while simultaneously hardening its resolve to hold territory seen as symbolically inseparable from its claim to represent China as a whole. And for Washington, the continuation of the crisis underscored the difficulty of applying containment doctrine in a context where adversaries could impose persistent costs without triggering clear thresholds for escalation, because each resupply mission escorted by U.S. naval forces risked incident or miscalculation. Yet, withdrawing support would have signaled a weakening of commitment that might reverberate across Asia, undermining confidence among allies already sensitive to perceptions of American resolve after Korea. And this tension was evident in the internal deliberations of the Eisenhower administration, where military planners prepared contingency options that extended from expanded conventional engagement to nuclear strikes against mainland artillery positions, while civilian leaders weighed the political consequences of such actions against the strategic importance of the islands themselves, an importance that was increasingly questioned even as the credibility of American commitments made disengagement politically hazardous. And this dilemma was further complicated by the evolving nuclear context of the late 1950s, as both superpowers possessed growing arsenals yet lacked established mechanisms for crisis communication and escalation control, increasing the weight placed on inference and signaling. And in this environment, the crisis became a testing ground for nuclear signaling short of use, as the United States quietly reinforced its regional capabilities and allowed ambiguity over its willingness to escalate to remain part of the deterrent calculus, while Beijing pursued a strategy that emphasized endurance and political resolve over decisive military victory, calculating that time itself could be a weapon by forcing Washington to confront the sustainability of its position. And as months passed without resolution, the artillery war took on a ritualized quality that masked its underlying danger, because the regularity of shelling and resupply operations created patterns that reduced the sense of immediacy even as they normalized the presence of violence, a normalization that risked sudden shock if those patterns were disrupted. And intelligence assessments during this period reflected this tension, as analysts attempted to determine whether Beijing intended to escalate, negotiate, or simply maintain pressure indefinitely, often reaching conclusions shaped as much by assumptions about rational behavior as by concrete evidence, assumptions that were themselves influenced by broader perceptions of Chinese strategy and leadership dynamics during a period of consolidation following domestic upheavals. And on the Chinese side, the crisis intersected with internal priorities, as sustaining the bombardment served to demonstrate resolve and unity while diverting attention from domestic challenges, reinforcing the leadership's authority through confrontation with external adversaries. Yet these domestic considerations also imposed limits, because prolonged conflict risked economic strain and international isolation at a moment when Beijing sought to stabilize its position within the socialist bloc and beyond. And this duality contributed to the careful management of the crisis, as both sides sought to extract advantage without provoking outcomes that would outweigh the benefits. And the offshore islands thus became a stage upon which broader Cold War dynamics were enacted in compressed form, with artillery fire substituting for direct confrontation and logistics replacing maneuver as the primary operational challenge. And throughout this phase, the absence of a formal settlement did not imply stagnation, because each decision to continue or adjust the pattern of bombardment and response subtly altered expectations and recalibrated deterrence, shaping how future crises would be approached, particularly in terms of distinguishing between symbolic commitments and vital interests. And by 1960, the persistence of the artillery war had effectively entrenched the Taiwan Strait as a managed conflict zone, where violence was continuous but bounded, and where escalation was constrained not by agreement but by mutual calculation under uncertainty, a condition that highlighted the paradox of Cold War stability, in which the avoidance of war often depended on the acceptance of ongoing conflict. And as the crisis moved toward its later stages, the question facing all parties was no longer how to achieve decisive victory, but how to sustain a precarious equilibrium without eroding credibility or inviting catastrophe, a question that would define the remaining years of the artillery war and influence broader Cold War thinking about limited conflict in the nuclear age. By 1960, the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis had become an entrenched condition rather than a discrete episode, and this transformation revealed how limited warfare could be sustained indefinitely through calibrated force and mutual restraint, because neither Beijing nor Washington perceived a clear pathway to resolution that would not incur unacceptable costs, and the artillery exchanges continued to serve as a mechanism for managing rivalry without crossing the threshold into open war, even as they imposed persistent strain on the parties involved. And within this stabilized yet volatile environment, the offshore islands functioned as both military outposts and political symbols, their continued defense reinforcing Taiwan's claim to legitimacy while simultaneously binding it more tightly to American strategic calculations. And, for the United States, the endurance of the crisis prompted a gradual shift from emergency response toward routine management, as escort operations, resupply planning, and intelligence monitoring became institutionalized tasks rather than crisis-driven improvisations, a shift that reduced the likelihood of sudden escalation while embedding American forces permanently into the operational rhythm of the strait. And this routinization had strategic implications because it signaled to Beijing that Washington was prepared to absorb ongoing costs to uphold its commitments, while also conveying that the United States sought stability rather than confrontation, a dual message that complicated Chinese assessments of American resolve and intentions. And on the Chinese side, the continuation of alternate-day shelling after periods of intense bombardment reflected a conscious effort to assert sovereignty claims without foreclosing diplomatic flexibility, allowing Beijing to present the conflict as an internal matter while maintaining sufficient pressure to deter any move toward normalization of the offshore island's status. And this framing was reinforced through diplomatic channels, as Beijing emphasized the illegitimacy of foreign involvement, while avoiding actions that would unify external opposition or justify multilateral intervention, a strategy that aligned with broader Chinese objectives of limiting internationalization of the Taiwan issue during a period of geopolitical realignment. And as the crisis persisted, the role of nuclear signaling remained an undercurrent rather than an overt feature, because while nuclear options were repeatedly discussed within American planning circles, their actual use was constrained by concerns over escalation, alliance cohesion, and global perception, leading to a reliance on ambiguity as a deterrent tool, an approach that allowed nuclear capability to influence calculations without being explicitly invoked. And this ambiguity was mirrored by uncertainty on the Chinese side regarding the thresholds that might trigger escalation, uncertainty that reinforced caution even as artillery fire continued, and intelligence collection during this phase focused increasingly on detecting shifts in intent rather than immediate preparations for attack, as analysts sought indicators of whether Beijing intended to escalate, de-escalate, or simply sustain the status quo, a task complicated by the deliberate regularity of shelling patterns that obscured change within continuity. And this emphasis on intent analysis highlighted the limits of available information, forcing reliance on inference and historical precedent rather than direct evidence. And within Taiwan, the prolonged crisis reinforced a siege mentality that shaped civil-military relations and defense planning, as resources were allocated towards sustaining exposed positions despite questions about their strategic value, reflecting the political importance of not yielding territory under pressure. And this posture was reinforced by American support, which provided not only material assistance, but political validation, strengthening Taiwan's resolve while simultaneously constraining its autonomy, because decisions regarding escalation or accommodation increasingly depended on American approval. And as these dynamics played out, the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis demonstrated how Cold War confrontations could evolve into enduring conditions rather than episodic clashes, with violence normalized and managed through implicit rules rather than formal agreements. And this normalization carried risks, because the longer such a condition persisted, the greater the potential for misinterpretation, accident, or leadership change to disrupt the fragile equilibrium, a risk acknowledged privately by policymakers on all sides even as they continued to operate within the established pattern. And by the early 1960s, the crisis had thus become a case study in limited conflict under nuclear shadow, illustrating how artillery, logistics, and signaling could substitute for decisive action in a strategic environment where escalation control was paramount. And as it moved toward its later stages, the question remained not whether the bombardment would end, but whether the mechanisms that contained it could endure amid shifting regional and global conditions, a question that would shape the final phase of the crisis and inform broader Cold War approaches to managing unresolved conflicts without war. As the crisis extended into its final phase between 1960 and 1961, its significance increasingly lay in how it influenced strategic assumptions rather than in the immediate military balance on the offshore islands, because by this stage, the artillery exchanges had become predictable enough to reduce the sense of imminent danger while remaining sufficiently destructive to prevent normalization, a paradox that defined the operational environment and shaped decision-making on all sides and within Washington. The persistence of the conflict contributed to a reassessment of the limits of extended deterrence in peripheral theaters, reinforcing the view that credibility could be upheld through sustained presence and logistical support rather than decisive escalation. A conclusion that reflected lessons drawn not only from the Taiwan Strait, but from earlier Cold War confrontations, where attempts at rapid resolution had risked uncontrolled outcomes, and this reassessment was evident in the increasing emphasis on alliance management and crisis endurance as core elements of U.S. strategy in Asia, as policymakers accepted that certain disputes would remain unresolved indefinitely, and that stability would depend on the ability to manage them without definitive settlement. And on the Chinese side, the continued shelling of Quemoy served as a reminder of unresolved sovereignty claims, while allowing Beijing to demonstrate restraint in the nuclear age, reinforcing a narrative of controlled assertiveness that balanced domestic expectations with international realities. And this balance was particularly important as China navigated its position within the socialist bloc and sought to avoid actions that might invite overwhelming retaliation or diplomatic isolation. And within Taiwan, the enduring nature of the crisis entrenched a defensive posture that prioritized holding exposed positions despite their vulnerability, reflecting the symbolic importance of the offshore islands in sustaining claims of legitimacy and continuity. And this posture was reinforced by the operational reality that withdrawal under pressure would have carried political costs that outweighed the military risks of continued defense, especially with American support mitigating the most immediate dangers. And intelligence assessments during this period increasingly focused on monitoring for deviation from established patterns, recognizing that the greatest risk lay not in the continuation of shelling, but in unexpected change, whether through escalation, negotiation, or internal shifts in leadership that might alter calculations. And this emphasis on pattern recognition highlighted the extent to which the crisis had become routinized, with analysts treating regular bombardment as background noise rather than a signal of imminent conflict, a mindset that reduced the likelihood of overreaction while increasing vulnerability to surprise. And as the crisis gradually de-escalated into a lower intensity but persistent standoff, its broader implications for Cold War strategy became clearer, because it demonstrated that limited conflict could be sustained under the nuclear shadow through mutual calculation and tacit rules, challenging assumptions that nuclear weapons would inevitably force rapid resolution of disputes, and instead revealing how they could freeze conflicts in place by raising the costs of decisive action. And this lesson resonated beyond the Taiwan Strait, influencing how policymakers approached other unresolved Cold War confrontations where symbolic stakes exceeded immediate military value. And in this sense, the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis functioned as an early example of managed confrontation in the nuclear era, where artillery fire, alliance commitments, and strategic ambiguity combined to produce a stable yet unresolved equilibrium, and as the artillery war settled into its long-term pattern, the immediate crisis receded without formal conclusion, leaving behind a transformed strategic environment in which the Taiwan Strait remained a permanent point of tension shaped by the lessons of endurance, restraint, and signaling, learned between 1958 and 1961, lessons that would inform subsequent approaches to crisis management and deterrence in Asia and beyond as the Cold War continued to evolve under conditions of persistent uncertainty. In the final assessment of the 1958 to 1961 artillery phase of the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis, its enduring importance rests not in territorial change or diplomatic resolution, but in the strategic habits it produced, because the crisis demonstrated that Cold War confrontation could be sustained for years through calibrated violence without forcing a decisive outcome, and that such endurance could itself become a form of stability under nuclear conditions. A lesson absorbed by all parties as the immediate intensity of the shelling gradually diminished. And for the United States, this experience reinforced a model of crisis management based on presence, logistics, and alliance reassurance rather than rapid escalation, shaping how American planners approached subsequent flashpoints where credibility and restraint had to be balanced over extended periods. And this model relied heavily on the assumption that adversaries shared an interest in avoiding catastrophic escalation, an assumption that held during the Taiwan Strait Crisis, but remained contingent on leadership calculations and perceptions that could not be guaranteed. And on the Chinese side, the artillery war validated an approach to limited force that allowed sovereignty claims to be asserted persistently without triggering overwhelming retaliation, demonstrating how political objectives could be pursued through sustained pressure rather than decisive action. And this approach fit within a broader pattern of Chinese strategic behavior during the period, emphasizing patience, symbolism, and control over tempo, while avoiding moves that would unify external opposition or undermine longer-term goals. And within Taiwan, the crisis entrenched a defensive identity shaped by exposure and endurance, reinforcing the political significance of holding territory under pressure and embedding the offshore islands into the island's security narrative despite their vulnerability. A narrative sustained by American support that both enabled resistance and constrained independent decision-making, binding Taiwan's security more closely to U.S. strategic calculations. And from an intelligence perspective, the crisis highlighted the limits of prediction in prolonged confrontations, as analysts were forced to distinguish between routine signaling and genuine indicators of change, a challenge that underscored the difficulty of interpreting intent when adversaries deliberately blur the line between violence and communication. And this difficulty contributed to a more cautious analytic culture that emphasized pattern analysis and escalation control over definitive judgments. And as the Cold War progressed, this experience informed broader thinking about limited war, deterrence, and the management of unresolved conflicts, illustrating how nuclear weapons could paradoxically enable persistent low-level violence by raising the costs of decisive escalation. And in this sense, the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis occupies a significant place in Cold War history as an early example of how nuclear-era confrontations could be prolonged indefinitely through mutual restraint without formal settlement, shaping expectations about stability and risk that extended far beyond the Taiwan Strait itself. And although the artillery exchanges eventually receded into the background of regional politics, their legacy endured in the strategic assumptions carried forward by all sides, assumptions that continued to influence behavior in the Strait and in other contested regions where symbolic stakes, alliance commitments, and nuclear deterrence intersected. And in this final view, the crisis stands as a reminder that Cold War stability was often achieved not through resolution, but through the management of unresolved tensions. a management that depended on endurance, calculation, and the acceptance of ongoing risk as the price of avoiding catastrophe. In concluding the artillery phase of the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis, what ultimately defined the period from 1958 to 1961 was the normalization of danger as sustained bombardment. Alliance signaling and nuclear ambiguity combined to produce a condition in which constant violence coexisted with strategic restraint, reshaping how Cold War actors understood both conflict and stability, because the crisis demonstrated that the absence of open war did not equate to peace, but rather to a managed equilibrium in which all parties accepted recurring risk as preferable to decisive escalation. And this acceptance became embedded in regional and global strategic thinking as the crisis gradually lost its immediacy without ever being formally resolved. And for the United States, the experience reinforced the viability of extended deterrence through endurance, showing that credibility could be maintained through sustained logistical commitment and controlled presence even when the defended positions carried limited intrinsic military value. A lesson that influenced later approaches to alliance reassurance and crisis management in Asia, while also underscoring the political costs of commitments that could not be easily disengaged without reputational damage. And on the Chinese side, the artillery war validated a strategy of persistent pressure that avoided decisive action while continuously asserting sovereignty claims, demonstrating how calibrated force could be used to shape adversary behavior over time, without triggering the consequences associated with overt war, a strategy that fit within the broader constraints of the nuclear era and reflected an acute awareness of escalation thresholds. And within Taiwan, the prolonged defense of the offshore islands reinforced a strategic identity rooted in resilience and external support, embedding the crisis into the island's security consciousness and shaping defense planning around the expectation of sustained pressure rather than short, decisive engagements, an expectation reinforced by years of bombardment that ended not with victory or defeat, but with endurance. And from a broader Cold War perspective, the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis illustrated how limited conflict could become institutionalized, governed by tacit rules and patterns rather than formal agreements, and how such institutionalization could reduce the likelihood of sudden escalation while simultaneously locking adversaries into long-term standoffs that resisted resolution. A dynamic that would recur across the Cold War in multiple regions where symbolic stakes, alliance commitments, and nuclear deterrence intersected. And in this sense, the artillery war over Quemoy and Matsu stands as a case study in the management of unresolved conflict, revealing how nuclear weapons altered not only the scale of war, but its duration and character, enabling prolonged confrontation under conditions of mutual restraint. And although the guns eventually fell quieter, the strategic lessons of the crisis endured, shaping how policymakers approach the problem of limited war in a nuclear age and reinforcing the understanding that Cold War stability often depended less on settlement than on the continuous management of risk, uncertainty, and restraint. A reality that defined the global order long after the shelling itself faded into history.